Long before his name became associated with war, Simo Häyhä lived a life defined by restraint and routine. He grew up in the Finnish countryside, where isolation was not a condition, but a way of being. The landscape shaped its people through necessity rather than instruction. Forests stretched farther than roads, and winters demanded patience, self-reliance, and respect for nature's limits. Daily life in rural Finland moved at a measured pace. Work followed seasons, not clocks. Hunting, farming, and maintenance were not hobbies but skills woven into survival. Häyhä learned early how to move through forests without disturbing them, how to observe without drawing attention, and how to endure cold without complaint. Silence was not empty. It was functional. This environment encouraged a kind of discipline that required no supervision. Tasks were completed without announcement. Success was quiet, failure personal. Häyhä did not grow up surrounded by crowds or constant conversation. He grew up surrounded by terrain that rewarded stillness and punished impatience. Over time, this shaped a temperament that was inward, controlled, and unremarkable to outsiders. He wasn't known for grand ambition or expressive personality. Those who encountered him described someone reserved, polite, and unassuming. In a culture that valued modesty, this was not a limitation, but a norm. Häyhä did not stand out, and he did not attempt to. His life followed predictable patterns anchored in responsibility, rather than aspiration. Marksmanship entered his life not as spectacle, but as practice. Shooting was a practical skill tied to hunting and familiarity with tools. Precision mattered because waste mattered. Ammunition was not fired casually, and success was measured by efficiency, not display. This approach cultivated patience and attention rather than excitement. Nature also trained endurance. Finnish winters did not forgive error. Cold demanded preparation, awareness, and restraint. Häyhä became accustomed to long periods of stillness, conserving energy and focus. Comfort was secondary to function. These habits were not learned in classrooms or drills. They were absorbed gradually through repetition. Nothing in this early life suggested notoriety. There were no signs of destiny or exceptional promise. Häyhä's world was small, local, and contained. Yet it was precisely this ordinary, disciplined existence that formed the foundation for what would come later. The silence of the Finnish forests did not announce him to history, but it prepared him for it. The winter of 1939 did not arrive quietly in Finland. It arrived with engines, artillery, and an ultimatum backed by force. The Soviet Union crossed the border expecting a swift campaign, confident that numbers and armour would overwhelm a small nation at the edge of Europe. What followed instead was a war shaped by climate, terrain, and resistance far stronger than anticipated. Finland was unprepared in material terms, but not in resolve. The country lacked heavy weapons, modern armour, and deep reserves. Yet it possessed something less measurable: familiarity with its land and the willingness to defend it. Forests, lakes, and frozen ground became obstacles for invading forces and assets for defenders. Geography entered the war as an active participant. The invasion shattered any remaining illusion of distance from global conflict. Villages, roads, and border regions were drawn into the machinery of war almost overnight. Civilians adapted as soldiers mobilized. Farms became supply points. Forest paths turned into routes of movement and ambush. The boundary between home and front dissolved quickly. For Soviet forces, the campaign was meant to be decisive. Massive troop formations advanced under the assumption that resistance would collapse under pressure. Instead, they encountered a defense that refused direct confrontation on unfavorable terms. Finnish units avoided open battles and relied on fragmentation, isolating columns, disrupting supply lines, and forcing the enemy to fight in unfamiliar conditions. Winter itself became a weapon. Temperatures dropped to extremes that punished exposure and mechanical failure alike. Vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned. Movement slowed. Finnish soldiers, equipped for cold and trained to endure it, used the environment not just to survive, but to dictate the pace of fighting. International attention followed as reports emerged of unexpected Soviet losses. The conflict was no longer seen as a simple border adjustment, but as a test of will. Finland's resistance challenged assumptions about power, scale, and inevitability. The Winter War became a symbol of how smaller forces could reshape outcomes through adaptation rather than superiority. For individuals like Simo Häyhä, the war did not arrive as ideology or strategy. It arrived as duty. Mobilization pulled ordinary men from routine into defense. The quiet rhythms of rural life gave way to a different silence, the kind that precedes contact, movement, and survival. The Winter War began not with speeches, but with the sound of snow under boots, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. Combat in the Winter War unfolded under conditions that redefined the meaning of endurance. At -40 degrees Celsius, the cold was not a background element. It was an active force that shaped every decision. Breathing burned the lungs, exposed skin froze in minutes, and metal turned hostile to touch. Survival itself required constant attention long before any thought of fighting the enemy. Movement became deliberate and costly. Snow swallowed sound but resisted motion. Each step risked exhaustion. Each pause risked freezing. Soldiers learned to manage energy with care, alternating between stillness and controlled bursts of activity. Sweat, normally a sign of effort, became dangerous. Moisture meant heat loss, and heat loss meant death. Discipline was measured not in aggression but in restraint. Weapons behaved unpredictably in such cold. Oil thickened, bolts slowed, and mechanical failure was common. Soldiers adapted by stripping weapons of unnecessary lubrication and relying on simplicity rather than complexity. Reliability mattered more than rate of fire. A rifle that worked once was worth more than one that failed repeatedly. Food froze. Water froze. Wounds froze. Medical care became an improvisation against time. Even minor injuries could turn fatal when circulation slowed and infection went untreated. The cold erased the line between combat casualty and environmental casualty. Nature claimed its share regardless of allegiance. Psychologically, the cold narrowed focus. There was no room for abstract fear or long-term thinking. Attention shrank to immediate needs: warmth, concealment, awareness. This mental compression stripped war of drama and replaced it with persistence. Victory was not defined by ground taken, but by survival maintained. For Finnish soldiers, familiarity with winter offered an advantage, but not immunity. Experience did not make the cold kinder, it made it predictable. Knowing how to build shelter, how to remain still for hours, and how to blend into snow-covered terrain allowed them to operate where others deteriorated. The forest became both cover and ally. In these conditions, patience was not optional. It was a survival skill. The environment rewarded those who waited and punished those who rushed. Combat slowed into moments separated by long stretches of stillness, where endurance mattered more than action. Within this frozen battlefield, Simo Häyhä's methods reflected adaptation rather than innovation. He used a rifle without a scope, not out of tradition, but practicality. Optics could fog, reflect light, or fail under extreme cold. Iron sights offered reliability. They did not magnify, but they did not betray position either. The absence of a scope forced intimacy with distance. Häyhä learned to judge range through experience, terrain, and instinct rather than magnification. This demanded patience and restraint. Shots were taken only when certainty outweighed risk. Ammunition was conserved not because of shortage alone, but because excess action increased exposure. Snow itself became part of his method. Packed in front of the rifle barrel, it reduced the visible cloud of breath and muzzle blast. Stillness was maintained for hours, sometimes days. Häyhä did not pursue targets. He waited for them. The forest concealed him not because he hid, but because he became part of it. Cold sharpened rather than dulled his effectiveness. Extended stillness numbed the body but cleared the mind. Discomfort became background noise. What remained was focus. The environment stripped away distraction, leaving only sight, timing, and control. His approach avoided unnecessary movement. No dramatic repositioning, no repeated firing. Each engagement was brief and final. The lack of a scope also reduced profile. No raised head, no glint of glass. Survival depended on remaining unseen even after success. Opposing forces struggled to understand what they faced. Losses occurred without clear source. Fear spread not because of visible threat, but because of absence. An enemy that could not be located altered behavior, slowed advances, and eroded confidence. The psychological effect outpaced the physical damage. Häyhä's effectiveness was not rooted in aggression, but in refusal to be drawn into chaos. He did not fight the battlefield, he let it work for him. Cold, silence, and simplicity aligned into a method that required no spectacle, no scope, no excess, no mercy once the decision was made. The name did not come from Finland. It emerged from fear on the opposite side of the front. Soviet soldiers began to speak of an unseen presence moving through the snow, striking without warning and vanishing without trace. In a landscape already hostile, this idea of an invisible enemy took shape quickly. The white forests of Karelia did not just conceal danger, they seemed to generate it. White camouflage transformed the battlefield. Snow-covered terrain erased outlines and distance, and Häyhä's stillness completed the illusion. When he lay prone, he did not resemble a soldier waiting to fire. He resembled the ground itself. There was no movement to track, no sound to follow, no signal that a human presence was nearby. Visibility existed, but perception failed. The nickname, White Death, spread because it explained something ordinary soldiers could not. Losses mounted without clear engagement. Patrols entered forests and did not return intact. Officers struggled to identify a pattern. The environment hid the shooter so completely that death felt detached from cause. This separation magnified fear far beyond the number of casualties inflicted. Importantly, the legend grew faster than the man. Häyhä did not cultivate reputation or alter his behavior in response to it. He remained focused on survival and duty, indifferent to how the enemy described him. The myth expanded on its own, fed by rumor, repetition, and the psychological strain of fighting an unseen adversary in extreme cold. The forests were not neutral ground. They were engineered into weapons through patience and familiarity. Finnish tactics avoided open confrontation, instead drawing invading forces into narrow paths, where movement slowed and awareness narrowed. Häyhä's role within this strategy was precise rather than dominant. He did not command battles. He shaped moments. Ambushes relied on anticipation rather than reaction. Häyhä studied routes, patterns, and timing. Soviet units moved predictably along forest roads and frozen trails. Once a position was chosen, it was not abandoned lightly. Waiting was an investment. Hours of stillness could lead to seconds of decisive action. Each ambush was designed to end before it began. A single shot, sometimes two, followed by silence. There was no pursuit, no confirmation beyond necessity. The goal was not elimination, but disruption. Confusion spread faster than casualties. Units slowed, halted, or diverted, uncertain where the threat lay. The forest amplified this effect. Sound travelled strangely in snow and trees. Shots echoed in misleading directions. Soldiers fired back blindly, wasting ammunition and revealing positions. The absence of a visible enemy turned discipline into panic. The forest did not reveal Häyhä, it multiplied his presence. These ambushes also carried strategic weight. Delayed columns meant stalled offensives. Stalled offensives meant exposure to cold, hunger, and further attack. Häyhä's actions intersected with larger Finnish tactics that aimed to fracture Soviet momentum, piece by piece, rather than confront it head-on. What made this form of combat particularly devastating was its restraint. Häyhä did not engage emotionally. He did not chase glory or tally numbers in the moment. Each ambush was an exercise in control, over movement, timing, and self. The forest rewarded this discipline by concealing him again once the moment passed. Over time, the idea of the White Death became inseparable from the environment itself. Soldiers did not fear a man so much as the snow-covered woods. The forest seemed to watch, to wait, and to punish intrusion. In that sense, Häyhä became less an individual combatant and more a symbol of how the land itself resisted invasion. As the Winter War dragged on, reports surrounding Simo Häyhä took on an almost statistical disbelief. The numbers accumulated not over years, but over weeks. In a conflict defined by mass formations and artillery, one man operating in silence produced results that seemed to belong to a different kind of war. His effectiveness was not constant motion, but constant presence, day after day, in the same hostile conditions, without spectacle. What made this concentration possible was not aggression, but routine. Häyhä did not hunt continuously. He operated within strict limits of endurance, weather, and opportunity. Some days yielded nothing. Others ended abruptly. The count grew because of consistency rather than intensity. He returned to the forest repeatedly, occupying the same mental space of patience and restraint, allowing outcomes to accumulate naturally. The brevity of the campaign amplified the impact. The Winter War lasted only a few months, yet within that compressed time frame, Häyhä's actions created disproportionate disruption. Soviet units faced losses not from grand offensives, but from disappearance. Patrols failed to return intact. Advances slowed. The pressure of unseen threat distorted planning and morale far beyond the physical damage inflicted. Importantly, the numbers were never the point for Häyhä himself. He did not track them in the moment, nor adjust behavior to increase them. His method remained unchanged regardless of outcome. This refusal to chase results preserved discipline. He avoided unnecessary exposure, maintained concealment, and withdrew when conditions shifted. The forest remained his constant, not the enemy. For Soviet forces, the psychological effect of accumulating casualties without confrontation was corrosive. Fear does not require scale to spread. It requires uncertainty. The idea that death could arrive without warning, without visible source, eroded confidence in leadership and procedure. Soldiers altered movement, hesitated at tree lines, and expended energy on protection rather than progress. As stories circulated, Häyhä's reputation expanded independently of direct observation. Numbers became symbols rather than measures. They represented not just loss, but vulnerability. The myth grew because it filled a gap in understanding. It explained what conventional explanations could not, how a small defending force could impose such disproportionate cost. The war did not end for Häyhä in silence. It ended in impact. During one of his final engagements, a bullet struck his face with devastating force. The shot did not kill him, but it destroyed bone and flesh, collapsing the careful balance he had maintained for months. In an instant, stillness gave way to chaos. The injury was catastrophic. Häyhä was evacuated unconscious, his condition critical. For days, survival was uncertain. The precision that had defined his role was replaced by vulnerability. He no longer controlled environment or outcome. His body became the battlefield, subject to surgery, recovery, and chance. This moment shattered the image of invulnerability that had grown around him. The White Death was revealed to be human, fragile, and breakable. The forest that had concealed him could not protect him forever. The injury did not diminish his record, it reframed it. Survival itself became the final measure of endurance. Recovery was long and incomplete. Häyhä awoke after the war had effectively ended, his face permanently altered. The silence that had once been tactical became personal. He did not return to combat. The war moved on without him, just as it had begun without his consent. What followed was not triumph, but withdrawal. Häyhä did not speak publicly about his actions in detail. He did not cultivate legend. His life after the war returned to quiet patterns, marked by survival, rather than celebration. The violence that had defined his wartime role did not define his identity afterward. The injury also closed the narrative arc in a way no victory could. It reminded observers that extreme effectiveness does not grant immunity. War consumes even its most disciplined participants eventually. Häyhä survived, not because he was untouchable, but because chance intervened where skill could not. In the end, the story of hundreds in a few months does not conclude with dominance, but with absence. Removed suddenly from the battlefield, Häyhä's silence returned, this time permanent. What remained were numbers, rumours, and the uneasy recognition that war can elevate individuals briefly, then discard them without ceremony. When Simo Häyhä returned from the Winter War, there was no parade waiting for him, no dramatic reinvention of identity. His survival itself felt almost accidental, as if history had briefly taken notice of him, and then moved on. The man who'd become a symbol during the fighting re-entered civilian life quietly, carrying injuries that reshaped his face and experiences that resisted explanation. Recovery was slow and isolating. Häyhä's wounds were not only physical, they marked a boundary between the life he had lived before the war and the one that followed. Speech was difficult at first, public presence uncomfortable. The silence that had once been tactical now became personal. He did not return with stories to tell or a desire to clarify myths. The war, for him, was something completed, not to be revisited. Unlike many wartime figures, Häyhä did not attempt to control his legacy. He offered short answers when asked and avoided public interpretation of his actions. This restraint was not bitterness or secrecy, but consistency. He had never sought attention in the forest, and he did not seek it afterward. His identity remained rooted in ordinary life, routine work, and distance from spectacle. The contrast between legend and reality became sharper with time. Newspapers and later historians debated numbers, methods, and meaning. Häyhä remained largely outside these discussions. The gap between the man and the myth widened, not because he denied the legend, but because he did not participate in sustaining it. His silence became part of the story. Living long after the war, Häyhä became a reminder that survival does not always come with resolution. He carried no public role as moral guide or military theorist. He existed as proof that even the most extreme wartime effectiveness could return to anonymity. The legend endured. The man endured differently. For Finland, Simo Häyhä's story evolved beyond biography. It became part of a collective memory shaped by survival against overwhelming odds. The Winter War itself occupied a special place in national identity, a moment when resistance mattered more than victory. Häyhä's image fit that narrative not as a conqueror, but as an embodiment of refusal. What made him symbolically powerful was not just his effectiveness, but his alignment with Finnish values as they were later remembered. Restraint, endurance, and defense rather than aggression. He did not represent expansion or dominance. He represented holding ground. In a small nation facing a vastly larger force, that distinction mattered. The forests, the cold, and the silence associated with Häyhä became shorthand for a broader idea that Finland survived not by overpowering its enemy, but by understanding its own limits and strengths. Häyhä's methods were seen as an extension of national terrain and temperament, rather than individual genius. He belonged to the land as much as to history. Over time, his figure was invoked in discussions of preparedness and sovereignty, not as a call to glorify violence, but as a reminder of vulnerability. The lesson drawn was not that war produces heroes, but that survival sometimes depends on discipline without spectacle. Häyhä's story was used to reinforce caution as much as pride. Importantly, the symbol remained defensive. Häyhä was not celebrated as an ideal to be replicated endlessly, but as a product of specific circumstances unlikely to return. This framing prevented his legacy from becoming militaristic propaganda. It remained rooted in memory rather than ambition. As decades passed, Häyhä's quiet post-war life reinforced the message. He did not become a permanent figure of mobilization or ideology. He faded into history while remaining present within it. This balance preserved the authenticity of the symbol. Resistance did not require permanence in violence. It required the ability to return to peace. In the end, Simo Häyhä's legacy exists on two levels that never fully merge. There is the man who survived the legend and chose silence. And there is the symbol that Finland retained, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, defense, patience, and restraint can shape history. What connects them is not myth, but continuity. A refusal to become louder than necessary, even when the world was listening.